Hey everybody, hello, welcome. This is the third AMA for today, but if this is the only one you're watching today, welcome to your first one for the day. Today we're going to be talking about security policy and endpoint management with Intune. We have an awesome crew here today. I'm going to go ahead and kick off with intros. First of all, I'm Mike Donosky. I'm a product manager here on the Intune team at Microsoft, and with me today, joined Laura. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself first?
Hello, thanks everyone for joining today. I'm a product manager alongside Mike on the Intune team. I work primarily in the security policy space and a lot around the Defender integrations that we have. So excited to be here, excited to chat about all things security policy and endpoint management.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. Thanks for being here today. And Matt, go ahead and why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. My name is Matt Call. I'm the PM architect over core infrastructure and security. So I handle all the cool stuff that you don't necessarily see, as well as anything that's sort of security related. And I work with Laura on some of the Defender stuff as well. So that's great.
Awesome. And rounding out the intros, Per, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Yes, hello, my name is Per Larsen. Like the rest of them, I'm in the Intune area. I'm in a team we call a CAT team, where we talk to our most strategic customers about adoption and bloggers, and I work with all of these cool kids.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, now you know who we all are, and we'd love it if you would share your questions with us. Head over to aka.ms AMA/Intune management. And so this crew, we have some history. We've all been kind of working together for a long time. I know I've been on the team for about maybe 5 years now, but when I first joined, and I think after Matt joined, one of the first founding members of sort of our team was Laura. So Laura, I'm going to pitch the first question to you, and it's kind of more of like a history lesson while some of the questions start to come in. Do you want to share sort of some of the history and some of the thought behind like where endpoint security came from in Intune and sort of how it lives in Intune and what some of those early like thoughts and ideas were on, traditionally it was all device configuration and all that good stuff, and sort of where the inspiration was for endpoint security.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think around the time that you joined, about 5 years ago, Intune had the ability to create policies that contain all the different settings that we have available today and sort of just target those and apply those to devices. We saw a gap in the market where we wanted to sort of bridge together security teams and IT teams to have very specific templated workflows for applying policies and security, applying policies and settings that were security focused. So what we did was partner with the Defender team, Microsoft Defender, to create a sort of curated experience for all things that are endpoint security related. So if you notice in the Intune portal, we actually have a cutout section called endpoint security, and that's sort of the one-stop shop to have dedicated templates and workflows and reporting and all the good stuff where we combine the power of the Defender agent and security settings that they offer with the Intune policy experience to apply policy for those Defender settings. So we have basically that place where you can see all of the devices you have in Intune as you would outside of the dedicated portal. But there you can also access like conditional access policy, a ton of different reports for policy, but then we have dedicated workflows for everything related to antivirus, endpoint detection, and response. We have BitLocker in there, and we actually have dedicated RBAC permissions for each of those sections. So you can create templates of settings related to that sort of security category and be able to apply policy in that curated way. We also include within their dedicated reports related to that sort of security section. So we have antivirus reports that tell you about the signature version of your devices that have the Defender agent. There's also integration that we had recently pushed out to allow admins within the Defender portal to access those same policies and manage them through Defender without having to jump between places. So we've come a really long way to have this sort of holistic experience both in Intune and Defender. And a lot of our integrated workflows kind of come through that. So we're continuing to work super close with the Defender team to bring more security goodness into Intune and sort of vice versa. And the idea is that it's a consistent, coherent experience for everything security related, kind of stemmed through that endpoint security blade. Happy to answer more questions from folks if they have ones about that in terms of the platforms that we support. We have a channel called MDE Attach, which allows you to actually apply those security policies to devices not even enrolled in Intune, just enrolled through Defender. And through that, we get to reach more coverage of devices or things not even supported through Intune, like, for example, Linux Server and Windows Server. So again, tons of goodness and lots of coverage through the integration we have with Defender.
Yeah, I think if I think back, one of the cool things about endpoint security is it's always given us a place to pioneer new technology in how we manage devices, whether it be new versions of reporting, the first templates that were settings catalog based behind the scenes off the unified settings platform, some of our early experimentation with having like cross-plat policy. I know we've gone back and forth on some of that. And so Matt, I'm going to tee you up for this next question here. We have Krishnamurthy has a question here in chat, but I'm gonna add on it a little bit in sort of the cross-plat, some of the cross-plat ideation there. And so the question, as it is, because I'll read it out: do we have a roadmap to bring server to Intune? Where are we on Linux endpoints and support with Intune endpoint security? And Laura, you touched on it a little bit with Linux and some of the Microsoft Defender for endpoint. But Matt, could you enlighten us a little bit on sort of the thought around how we should think about client versus server and MD attach and when to use what? And then bonus question for you: what happens when you kind of switch between them? Because I'll tee you. I know the answer. This isn't really fair, but I'll tee you up for that.
Yeah, sure. Easy questions. Perfect. All right. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I don't know if it's just me, but so server management in Intune. Today we support the primary workloads that Laura identified through MDE. And the main reason why we support those workloads is because, a large portion of a security management or a large portion of the security management role is to manage client endpoints. I mean, they're usually the cattle in the pet versus cattle sort of scenario. And then usually there's light management of servers that go along. So, like Laura was talking about, when we architected MDE attach and the MDE integration, 90% or so coverage. I don't know if the number's correct, but it was high, right? There's a high percentage of coverage for clients. And then it just didn't make sense to relegate these other platforms like Windows Server, Linux Server, et cetera, even though they were small in number or smaller in number compared to clients. It was really important that we gave admins a single experience to manage things like AV policy, AV exclusions. And, when I joined the team, Laura owned antivirus, which is probably the highlight of her entire Microsoft career, I'm sure. But, that whole piece, it was really important so that you didn't have to create exclusions in two places. You have to create AV policy in two places, et cetera. So as, we've started to talk more and more about cloud native management and cloud management, what ends up happening is customers naturally say, how do I cloud manage servers, right? So I think two things you got to remember about servers is that their role in enterprises are currently changing. I could be quoted multiple times as saying that server sort of tech or server management tech is usually about 5 or 6 years behind client. So right now we're having that same sort of conversation that we had in like the 2019, 2020 timeframe around how do I cloud manage devices or endpoints, and now we're having it about servers. Today, Microsoft recommends using Azure Arc to connect your on-prem servers to the Azure Management Fabric and getting all of the goodness out of the Azure Management Fabric. We have Azure Policy. They're working on things around Azure Apps, and they're working on things around update management. So that's really the place today to cloud manage servers. And I don't foresee that changing anytime in the near future, especially as servers start migrating from a role in organizations where they're long-lived to closer to a cloud resource, which is what you see. Most Azure resources are cloud resources that are provisioned and decommissioned as part of workload spinning up or workload spinning down or stretching out, whatever that might be. So that's important. So that's the first piece. The second piece around Linux, we've worked really hard to build the compliance engine and the compliance piece into Linux to begin. And we're constantly having conversations about how do we extend our capability on Linux and what's the right capability to extend, right? So Laura mentioned that we do support every distribution that MDE supports in terms of deploying security settings to those devices. We constantly have conversations with the MDE team about extending the security fabric in different workloads, as well as on the Intune side, what does enrolling a Linux device mean? And what sort of capability should we offer through Intune? So I don't have anything specific to share around what that might look like or what investments might come to market soon. But all I can say is we're constantly evaluating that. You should give us you give feedback all the time. Heather has a great link she's going to put up on the screen right now around Intune feedback. Man, she's on top of it. So give us your feedback, your Linux scenarios. I think this is the reason why it's particularly challenging with Linux is they're usually heavily specialized workloads or maybe fragmented workloads. So we just got to figure out what the right thing to do is and, how we're going to invest in this area moving forward. But we need feedback on Linux. I would say we don't get enough feedback on Linux. That answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, perfect. And the feedback, again, aka.ms/Intune feedback, please. And that's where, we listen and you can give us your feedback. And speaking of feedback and speaking of learning, I'm going to pop over to a question for Per. There's a question in chat about updates, and this isn't necessarily, it's probably not the right session for update questions. However, I'm going to hand it over to you to sort of talk about, because I know that you work a lot with sort of where as feature PMs will generally build out scenarios and things like that. And I know that you have a lot of experience. First of all, you help us tremendously in building out the feature by also bringing that feedback. Again, aka.ms/Intune feedback for more feedback. But what are some tips that you have or ways that you've seen some common misconfigurations or even when you start off on a project and going in, and especially if you could put a security focused on it. I know you and I have been working really closely with a lot of the EPM deployments and folks who are trying to make sure that they're successful. But what are some thoughts that you'd like to share, some learnings that you have for the crowd here this morning?
Yeah, so it depends on where the customer's coming from, but often we see customers start with the policy inside the security blade, because that is where the security department actually wants things to be configured, especially if they're coming from a third-party product. So doing that, what I see the biggest issue that we hear from customers is around conflicts, to actually figure out if you, as an IT admin or different IT admins, is creating policies in different places in Intune, how do we actually handle conflicts? So one of the good things that I think we have is the conflict resolution inside Intune, where you actually get the report. And with the new Explorer option that we got in Intune, it's so much easier to actually troubleshoot and look for specific settings across all of your policies to see, did I actually configure this one in a different policy? So compared to DPOs where it's handled differently on the client side, in Intune you need to be more aware of how do you actually configure it, don't make conflicts, and start simple. Start with the security baseline, then add on top of that, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, and at the end use the settings catalog for the rest of the settings, but avoid conflicts. Another things that we see is some policy settings are user specific and others are device specific, just like in GPOs. So that can also be an issue for some customers when you look at it.
Yeah, and so I'll add a little bit onto that, and then pop into the next question that we have as well, which is kind of in that area. Which, like, when you're talking about conflicts, a lot of times it can either happen because you have multiple people going in and building policy, and they don't realize they have overlap. So I'll actually jump right into that one, and whoever wants to sort of jump on this. From a management's perspective, when you have, this is from Cooper, by the way. Thanks, Cooper, for the question. For thinking from like an MSP, a managed service provider's perspective, thinking about zero trust and the fact that there's a lot of provider solutions, but they require like guest admin the accounts. And so when we're thinking about like multi-tenancy, how do we, do you have any thoughts on sort of best practice or even some good ideas on multi-tenancy, like using guest accounts, how you should audit that, how you should keep track of it, what's worked in the past or anything like that? Sort of, it kind of gets into like the RBAC and permissions, role-based access control and permissions model a little bit. But Per, did you have anything to share on that? Or Matt, I can also hand off to you or Laura.
Yeah, first of all, when you go in as an MSP partner, you have different options. One of them is the Lighthouse. The other one is the Microsoft Partner Center. And I think it was last month we announced the collaboration between two different third-party products to provide multi-tenancy support for MSPs within Intune.
Cool. And I think the other thing I was going to sort of mention, because you were talking about, I came back to it, device and user. The thing to think about with device is if it's device scope, it's going to hit HKey local machine, which essentially means it'll hit all the users on the device. If it's user scope, then essentially it will only impact the user. Now, of course, you can target those however you would like. If you target user to a device, it'll impact all the users on the device. If you target user to a user, it'll just hit that user. Device to device, it'll work normally. The one you have to look out for is if you target device scope to a user, if that user logs onto a machine, that's going to hit any user on the machine. So there was a question, I didn't fully read it yet, but maybe we'll come back to it as well if it's the same one. But for like multi-session devices, no, this is an auto patch question. We'll come back to that. But like for multi-session devices, it's very delineated so that the device will only pick up user policy during a user sync, only device policy during a device sync. So if AVD multi-session is in your present or your future, just be aware of that before you go create policy. There's some pretty easy ways to get around it, but it's just something to be aware of. Not to get around it, but make sure you use it correctly. The next question, are there audit logs for Intune management? Who deleted the device and that? Laura or Matt, would you like to chime in on that? I know the answer as well. But.
Sure. Yeah, Intune has really rich audit logging. I'd say the biggest feedback we get from Intune audit logging is that it could potentially be too verbose. As I think is the issue with all audit logging is, you want your audit logs to be complete. You want to make sure you know the actor in the action. You want to be able to track them for a certain number of days. I mean, we have a number of customers who are pulling audit logs directly from our platform into other platforms to marry them with, like sign-in logs from Entra and this sort of stuff. So we do have the level of granularity I think that most folks desire, and audit logs, like deleting a device, is definitely in the audit logs. There are some scenarios you should be aware of around, like device deletions are a perfect example because, wipes and device deletes do some things together. So that can make things sometimes hard to discover in the console, but all of that stuff is in the audit log. So you can see who deleted a device, who wiped a device, when, etc. Generally, when people ask questions about like delete device or similar high volume actions, the answer usually is your filter wasn't granular enough to be able to find the event because there's thousands of rows. So if you have some ideas on how we can make that more useful for you, whether that's better filters, better UX experiences, or maybe, I'm a liar and we haven't seen the event that you're looking for, Give us that feedback again at aka.ms/Intune feedback. I got that right. I didn't know I was going to have to read it off the screen. So Intune feedback. And we'd love to make sure you have the right audit data because, in the world of zero trust and, all these other people in your organization or churn in your organization, you want to make sure that you notice who does what, when, and why. So that's it. And I don't know, Laura, if you had anything else to add, but that's my spiel on audit logging. Oh, Laura, I get a thumbs up. Okay, great. Cool.
Matt, I have something to add.
Oh, sorry, Per, go ahead.
A question we often get from customers is, what do we actually do if we need to look at the audit logs 2 months after something is deleted or changed? So we have the export options from within Intune where you can export it to other places. That could be inside Azure, file shares or something like that. So please set that one up if you have a requirement to look more than a month back in your audit logs.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. I'm gonna. So Cooper came back. He said, "Thanks. I agree. Partner Portal's been a lifesaver, and there's been a lot of great upgrades." So awesome. Thanks for following up on that partner question, Cooper. We had another question come up around AVD in Per. I think this. If we don't know this, that's fine. But talking about patching on AVD and using auto patch, do you have any? This is a little bit outside of. Again, this is the security policy and endpoint management with Intune AMA. But we'll take a shot at some of the ones a little bit outside of our purview. But there's a statement in here, and I'm not familiar with it, but it's around relaxation on vulnerability management in terms of quality updates. Do you have any insight into that? The question is, we're missing patching directly from auto patch for AVD? Is that something you're familiar with?
No, not directly. I know that we are missing AutoPath's direct integration into Windows 365 Frontline, but I'm not aware of what we are missing in the AVD space.
Okay.
But again, our feedback. Feedback.
We can take that to our buddy Chris over on the AutoPatch team and see if we can get an answer posted for you. I'm sure that managing multi-session devices or even single session in that matter in virtualization is a complex topic on its own. We could probably have our own AMA on that. So,
and AVD is this different flavors. So single session, persistent, non-persistent, multi-session. So it's a big question.
Got it. So speaking of challenges, we're going to go around the room on this one. Matt, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the biggest challenges you've seen for customers where they've sort of solved it in the past couple of years? And then what are some of the major challenges you see going forward in the next few years, especially as it pertains to endpoint security as folks sort of think about project planning? I know at the end of the year, it's always good to sort of look back at what you've done this year and then start thinking ahead about some of the projects and stuff that you have coming up next year. What are some of the trends that you're seeing in the endpoint security space?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm a rule of threes guy, so let me see if I can find three. So first, the thing that's top of mind for me recently is the pace of change that's hitting endpoints. I think that this is probably driven by the innovation in AI and things like agents. And it's not that these things are going to in some cases, they are going to directly impact the way that you manage devices. But I think what's going to end up driving it is, when the ecosystem, basically gets up to full throttle on AI. I think from my perspective, they're not to full throttle yet. But once all of the software that you manage, the device vendors get up to full speed and we get mainstream adoption, I don't think we're that far away of all of these AI features and the way that they operate on devices. I think that's going to change the underpinnings of what you need to do with device management at a speed that I hope everybody is ready for, or at least preparing for. We did a recent keynote at a community event in Europe where we talked about, this change is coming and how do I start to even think about it? And, what we're seeing more is that 10 years ago, the default would have been just shut everything off, right? I mean, this is like the IT standard 10 or 15 years ago, just shut everything off. And now we see organizations embracing technology because they need the technology to sort of be a force multiplier for their business. So Now it's how do I control the quote unquote change that's coming my way, and how do I do it in a very granular fashion that makes me feel good about what I'm doing. So I think that's the sort of first set of challenges. And then the second set of challenges I see is all the things that we're securing our devices to protect against threats, malware actors, etc. All those changes I just talked about, they're going to adopt them faster than most organizations probably to do nefarious things. So that complicates the threat landscape and how we need to think about protecting our estate. And it's probably maybe a sub bullet of bullet one, but I think it deserves its attention of like, hey, how are adversaries coming towards my organization? As costs lower, that means you're going to see a higher volume of just nefarious activities against my enterprise. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing to round it out, because I like threes, is I think agents are really big. And I like, not just agents in, what we as Microsoft or other people are shipping as agents. I think that they're probably closer to the new coding language. Like they're the next version of PowerShell. And like, how can I adopt this technology in order to make my job easier and sort of deal with problems 1 and problem 2 that we just discussed? And I think those are the big 3 things that, if you're not thinking about at least those 3 things, there's probably 100 other things you should be thinking about. But if you're not thinking about at least those 3 things, you're probably going to have a rough next couple of years as you try and keep up versus being proactive about endpoint security and endpoint management. I know that was a long answer.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
And it reminded me a lot of times we'll get questions all the time. We're talking about, the people we interact with are seeing things before we see them, obviously at certain points. And I remember they're like, you get a random question and people are like, how do I block browser extensions that have AI models inside of them that are able to exfiltrate data, or like, someone's going to download an extension that's supposed to help them with productivity, but we don't know where that data is being stored. And suddenly you've got an exfiltration, there's good spirit behind your folks wanting to go ahead and like embrace the change and go and use these things. But how do you make sure it's in a secure way? And how do you make sure that it's, legitimate sources and whatnot? And we do have a question here. I'm gonna pop over to Per, speaking about building some things out. And then Laura, I'm gonna come back to you with another question on sort of security advances going forward. But Per, are there any plans to expand on the functionality of endpoint privilege management? And are there any changes that can be done to speed up the reply from elevation requests?
Oh, yeah. We have a change coming out to Windows to actually speed up the notification. I assume we're talking about the notification back to the end user. So yeah, we are aware of that. Our team and Mike is working on it, and hopefully we'll see it in product very soon.
So we're laughing a little bit. I'm the PM for endpoint privilege management, and Per and I work together like every day on all the things that are coming out in EPM, Intune endpoint privilege management. There's like I think I just shared on LinkedIn or something, like the last 3 things we just built: wildcard support for rules, so you can get a little bit less granular on rules and still get rule matching. We have argument support, so you could get more granular, right? Like we're trying to make this as flexible as possible so that you can build the rules that you really need. And I think, Per, you sort of undersold the changes that have happened in the support approval flow this past year, probably just about a year. We've spent probably half of our time as an engineering team working on new features like the wildcard support. We have some cool stuff to announce very, very soon around, I think it's actually in development already, so it's not really an announcement, but you'll see more on Ignite for elevating as the current user, right? So our core security model is all around elevating as a virtual account. Sometimes that can cause issues, so sparingly when the need arises for AppStream runtime to maintain that user context, we're going to add the ability for rules to elevate as user. But the other 50% of the time we spend on quality. And so, and not just quality, it's listening to customers and it's making small changes. Like, you talk to someone and they go, 24 hours is just too quick for us to be able to approve an elevation. It's 7 days now. We got feedback around the timing around support approval for that push notification to come back down to the device. We've been working really close with the Windows team. Huge shout out to the Windows team that works on that area, because we were able to get that down quite a bit. And we're seeing now with like a couple different tweaks in there, it's sub 1 minute, and in some cases it's just a few seconds, which is phenomenal. So yeah, those are some of the endpoint privilege management improvements. And Laura, I'm going to bring it back to you. I would like to know, if you don't mind sharing, what one of the highlight sort of like, because you work closely with Defender, you probably work more closely with the Defender team than us on the call. What's sort of like the highlight thing that came out this past year, and then what's one of the new things that have been announced by the Defender team that we're working with them to sort of integrate going forward in the next few months?
Yeah, for sure. So at the beginning of the call, I sort of mentioned some of the history in terms of how we've more closely partnered with Defender to deliver curated endpoint security management experiences. There's actually an awesome comment from James in the chat calling out that endpoint management is security, and it always has been. And endpoint teams and security teams need to work together. So we believe that is absolutely true. Our sort of mission statement with this integration is to deliver a consistent, coherent, and covered experience between the two services. And we have been making some really great investments in this past year and continuing to do that in the upcoming cycles to allow more types of security settings to be available for all the platforms that we support. So we had mentioned in the past that for devices that are supported through MDE attached, so not even necessarily enrolled to Intune, and that's how we sort of reach Linux server and macro OS server devices. There's been a lot of great investments in shipping more types of settings to those platforms, and we're continuing to support that with Defender teams. So I think we pushed out some more antivirus settings. There's more stuff coming out around EDR exclusions. I know there's some investments coming for update controls for Linux server. And all of this is keeping in mind a consistent experience with what's there in Windows, because that's obviously a very mature area. So the idea is to continue expansion and coverage with a consistent feel through these channels that we support. And again, just making sure the breadth is there for what we support. In addition to that, I think the cohesion with Defender, again, is super important. We made really great strides with shipping experiences within the Defender portal to manage security policy, but there's still a couple of friction points that we want to address and make it super, super smooth to really empower admins to manage their policies as easy as possible. So there are a couple of different management constructs that we want to smooth out. So within how grouping and targeting works, with Intune policies, everything goes through Entra groups. It's how you roll out policies. I know Defender has some slightly different concepts with Defender groups. So we want to bridge some gaps in terms of how we can bring some of those Defender specific constructs to work super smoothly with the stuff that Intune has. That sort of goes the same with RBAC. We have some different RBAC roles with Intune versus Defender. Again, we want to make that super smooth for admins to be able to manage policy from whatever context they're coming from, so that there isn't extra clicks or toggles that folks have to put in place to make it work. We just want it to be smooth right off the bat. So I think in terms of cohesion, frictionless experience, that's very top of mind. and also coming together with more of the power that Intune and Defender has. For example, some of the reporting capabilities that Defender might have, and you might need to jump to that portal to see, and that's not native in Intune. We want to bring more of the capabilities that Defender can have to even see what like the effective value of a setting is on a device and show that within context of the Intune policy that's applied to that device. So again, just bringing more partnership between the data and capabilities that each service has, and making it one endpoint management solution. I'll also call out. I'll also call out sort of what Matt had mentioned around the world of agents coming into play. There's so many really cool and applicable scenarios where agents can come into the security context. So there's a couple of things out now around managing vulnerabilities. That's all Defender vulnerability management data, and using Intune agents to actually address the most critical ones that come in, to really fast track and allow admins to see and manage those things in a quick way. I think that's just the very tip of the iceberg of the stuff that's available to us and sort of the scenarios that we want to go after. So especially from the security context, using Defender and Intune together, I think the agents and sort of co-pilot scenarios are going to be super top of mind and super important coming up in the next few cycles.
Yeah, and for folks, if you haven't used some of the co-pilot scenarios yet, I highly recommend, if you're giving it a trial, you're giving it a spin, especially like if you are using EPM, there's an easy way that you can just pass that hash over to, pass the file hash associated with a report that's coming in over to Copilot, which will go and hand it to threat intelligence and bring you back a little summary about potential maliciousness of that binary. Or you can ask about different settings. And really, when we think about agents versus skills, the agents are really tying all of these skills together and giving you this end-to-end scenario where we're sort of taking a workflow or going from an input and bringing you all the way through to an insight and then taking action on it. And speaking of taking actions on insights and kind of stepping back from the Copilot and AI side, we have a question here from the tech community, and I'm going to hand this one to Matt. So I'm going to read it out. Intune integrates with Defender and conditional access for risk-based compliance. But how does integration handle real-time enforcement across non-Windows devices? So there's a lot of qualifiers in here. So we're talking about Defender and conditional access for risk-based compliance on non-Windows devices. And for example, if a mobile threat is detected and a device is even offline. So there's a couple different caveats in there, but if you want to start broadly for the folks who might not be familiar with risk-based compliance, and then sort of go down into non-Windows, and then also for potentially offline scenarios or even between syncs.
Thanks, Mike. Seems like a softball. So I appreciate you. No, just kidding. Yeah. So yeah, so there we go. So Mike, I'm not going to try and name out all the vendors that we have mobile threat events. We call this scenario MTD. MTD relationships with, because I'll miss one and it'll be bad. But there's documentation in Intune. We have a bunch of mobile threat defense partners that all integrate with us in this fashion, where they generate and determine risk, and then they tell Intune the risk, and then Intune acts based on the risk that is received. So the first interesting note about this scenario is that this has no dependency on Intune communicating with the device to function properly. Intune is sort of out of this scenario from a device management perspective or from a communication from service to client. When we do this integration specifically, I'll just use the Defender example. When we do this integration with Defender, what ends up happening is Defender has its normal process to basically collect information about what's executing on a device, what the health of the binaries are, all of this stuff that we probably don't need to get into here. But take my word for it that they have the right fingerprint on the device to determine the risk of that device and a bunch of indicators that determine that risk. So once they have that information, or any MTD has that information, they've set up an established channel with Intune where we communicate either from their product in the cloud or their product on-prem directly to Intune through a normal service-to-service communication channel. On that channel, they send us information about the risk. And when we get information about that risk, we will generate compliance calculation based on that signal. This is one of the few areas in Intune where we generate or recalculate compliance without actually having to talk to the device, right? So in that scenario, let's just say you require devices to be at secure, which is the lowest signal for mobile threat defense vendors. If we require them to be at secure and then their risk elevates to low, that signal is sent from the client or from the service that the MTD vendor that you're integrated with. Let's just call it Defender. Defender sends to us and says, hey, device 1 is now at low. Intune generates a compliance calculation for that device and says, does low match the value needed to be compliant? If yes or no. If it's no, then we send the non-compliant bit to Entra, just as we would every other compliance scenario. And then from there, the device's tokens, everything that's issued is now either valid or invalid based on that compliance calculation that's there. And of course, we apply your grace period rules. There's emails that can get sent. There's all sorts of non-compliance criteria you can add to a compliance profile. But that's essentially how it works at a very high level. So I know, again, we don't require any communication with the device to facilitate this flow. It's all based on the vendor who you've trusted as your mobile threat defense vendor and the logic they've put on these risk determination scenarios. And every vendor operates a little bit differently, but the pattern I just covered basically covers their high level flow of like, hey, I get information, I determine there's a risk, I tell Intune influences compliance the right way. So hopefully that answers the question. If not, ask us again, or maybe I don't know, maybe you have more context you want us to give. That's fine. We're always happy to talk about this sort of stuff because it's really important. Mike was there. It was a few conferences ago where I created this faux project called Project Blueberry, where I would just attack the Defender service to prove out this whole flow. And it's really awesome the way that it works. So test it in your enterprise. It's key. It's paramount to zero trust and making sure that, hey, you can use these signals to quickly revoke access to devices that become unhealthy. So it's awesome.
Right. And that signal detection evolves over time. So as threats emerge, like Blueberry, the system will adapt in order to, if it sees that level rise up. And these are one of those areas, and I know that there's probably some folks who've been around, and maybe I'll lose some folks on this, but like thinking back to Exchange on-prem and like ABQ rules and like the real predecessors of conditional access. It's just so cool to see how far the technology has come in like 10, 15 years to the point where everything's totally automated in that respect. And speaking of total automation, there's a question here. Would it be possible to introduce dynamic Intune policies based on things such as risk levels, locations, and known application vulnerabilities? This is a possibility question, so anything's possible. Risk level, I think Matt just kind of talked about, where you can sort of adjust with conditional access and have risk level built into your conditional access policy. Locations is something that we haven't necessarily gone too far into. Some of that comes down to platform capability. For Windows CSP fans, you might know that there's a dynamic management CSP buried away in there that we haven't quite used. But no, there's no plans. Possibility versus plans is a big thing, unless anyone on the call wants to sort of come out and say anything around some of those other ones. A lot of it just comes down to conditional access, because the philosophy is not that like, if you have security, it might not be that like, oh, something bad happened, I should ramp up my security. It's more so, let's put all the pieces in place, and if there is an event or something like that, and especially with like risk levels and stuff like that, it's more about monitoring and managing what that device has access to, which is the core value of conditional access.
And my conditional access has some location-based policies as well.
Yeah,
that is being asked for.
It's less like, hey, you are now in a new location. Let's BitLocker your device. That's not really what we're looking at necessarily, but yeah, it's a great call out for conditional access for location based. So you can require different things based on, if someone's traveling or stuff like that. We have a question here. I'm not sure if we know the answer to this one, but using MAM without enrollment and app protection policies, is there a way to require Defender to not just be installed, but also have check for harmful links enabled? Anyone know the answer to that? Otherwise, we can follow up. I might have to follow up on that one.
Yeah, I think we can follow up on that. I know that there's some app protection configurations you can deploy and require when Defender's running. I know that there's some other capability you can have to make sure that Defender is checking the health of the device, and if that gets delayed for more than 7 days, or I don't forget what it is, but there's timers you can configure to give like grace effectively on how often we have to hear from the device, etc. So there's a lot of options there. We can see if we can get that information for you and post it back to the chat. Yeah. And again, if you have any other piece of feedback like this, we have our feedback link, aka.ms/Intune feedback, which just showed up on the screen right now. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, that's what you should do. If you stump us on a question, give us feedback on what you need, and we'll get it to the right person and make sure that we get that.
Absolutely. And also just a shout out for if you're in the Intune console, hitting that smiley face, giving us a thumbs up or thumbs down, or it might be a smile or a frown. I haven't used it in a little while, but that also gives us feedback directly in case you're not currently at an AMA. But always, go head over to that aka.ms/Intune feedback for any feedback as well. Let's see. So we're almost close to the it's not the top of the hour. People say the bottom of the hour. It's almost half past the hour. And anyone have anything that they kind of want to bring up? The only other thing I wanted to sort of bring up, because Laura reminded me when she was talking about all the integrations we have, Intune's always we refer to as the sort of the glue that sticks a lot of these scenarios together. And it just reminded me, we're always adding new settings, and being in the EPM world, there's administrator protection. We get a lot of questions around when do I use administrator protection versus EPM? And the real short, quick answer is if you're an admin on the box or your users are admins, administrator protection is just solid security advancements that help with, token-based attacks, that it makes sure that you're elevating as the virtual account, just like we do in EPM today. And then if your standard user, use EPM, because the core value of EPM is when you move to standard user, you still have that rule set in that default elevation policy that lets you elevate the things you need to stay productive, the things your users need to stay productive, and obviously right size that based on reporting, and you got a good scenario right there. But at the high level, admin protection for admin users and EPM for standard users. With that, anyone else? With the time we have left, and we still got maybe a few more questions trickling in here, but anyone else have any parting shots as we kind of start wrapping up here?
I would definitely say that feedback from customers is helping. So when Laura was speaking about what we actually did in the endpoint security space over the last year, so one of the feedback that we got from customers was we had too many policy types that you could actually create in the endpoint security. So Laura and the team has worked pretty hard to actually get that down to a minimum. So now you only need to figure out if it's actually Windows, config manager, or a different OS that you need to manage compared to what we had previously. And that is based on customer feedback that we get.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll even call out that besides trying to get more breadth for settings and workflows, we're also taking in consideration for stuff that's already in production, and making sure that we can make some tweaks or try to make that management smoother. One great example is managing device control policies. There's a ton of complex logic that goes into managing the set of USBs and removable storage that you want to apply a ton of different rules on. So we have taken some feedback from customers using those types of complex settings and looking at small ways that we can make managing those a lot easier. Some of those things just come down to the UX experience, making different links available and making sure that the UI is organized in a way that's easier to consume and manage. But that feedback also plays into how the actual client and setting works itself. So we have some investments that we look at to actually change some of the client behavior and making sure that that's working in an easier and smoother way. Again, all based on customer feedback. So this stuff really does come to us. We really do take a look, and it impacts our roadmap of new stuff that we want to ship, because there's a ton of new stuff, but we also want to make sure the current things that are available have the utmost quality and are being used in the right way. So again, that's why we're here, and we really take that seriously.
Thanks, Laura. That was a great answer. And Matt, I'm going to hand it off to you, but I'm also going to sprinkle another one in here because I know you've been, I wouldn't say heads down, because you're not really heads down on everything. You're going to heads up on everything if we're going to be pedantic. But we've got a question in here about a wipe request for a device that a user took with them when they left, which maybe this is the first time I've ever heard of this happening. But an Intune that hasn't done the wipe yet. So as an IT admin, sort of like, what's the confidence level? Is it because it's not on the network yet? Is it going to continue sending the wipe? And then if you want to expand on that as you like, and you can add some top of mind to that as well.
Sure. Just sprinkle a device action question in there. I love it. Yeah. So the important thing to remember about device wipes is that for our device service, or, in Intune, there's a bunch of core services. And one of those core services is to manage the identity and lifecycle of a device. When you wipe a device, the state of that device effectively goes to wipe pending. And what that means is the service is ready to wipe that device the next time that the service hears from that device. Now, a couple interesting things that can happen is, that device record follows our normal life cycle for devices. So I think by default, devices age out after 270 days. I think that's the number that sticks in my head. And then you can configure policies that are different than that. But that's the important thing to remember, is that pending sits in our service waiting for that device as long as that record's there. And it's not always that long. There's a bunch of things that can influence that record being cleaned up. But once it enters that state, we're waiting to hear from that device. And as soon as we do, we tell it to wipe the device. Now, in theory, you probably hire really smart employees. And if they left with a device, because they're really smart, they may have re-imaged or, rebuilt that device, in which case the MDM enrollment or the enrollment to our service is likely gone. So in that scenario that I just described, that device may sit and wipe pending forever, because the device will never come back to us, because the device has been re-imaged or rebuilt. So it doesn't know that it has to return to us, or doesn't even know it was enrolled with us to begin with, which is usually a good sign. It means that your company data is no longer on that device if it was rebuilt and re-imaged, generally speaking. But that's sort of how this wipe scenario works. So yeah, it'll sit there, it'll be pending, it'll wait to hear from the device. And as soon as it hears from the device, the first response we give that device is, hey, wipe. And depending on the enrollment method, whether it was a full MDM enrollment, maybe it was a MAM enrollment, MAM configuration or app protection scenario or app config scenario, it might just erase the app. But there's wipes can be used both on app instances, on devices, etc. So yeah, this is generally how wiping a device works. I know it can be complex because we just spoiler alert, we just rebuilt all of our device action documentation. It should be much easier. Shout out to Paulo for rebuilding all of that documentation for us. It just went live on Friday. So if you have any more questions about device actions, it's set up really nicely now on the pane. So go ahead and take a look. And if you have any feedback, file it right there on the docs, and we'll drive some more clarification. So yeah, Mike, thanks for the device action question. Appreciate it. And back over to you, buddy.
Yeah, and as you know, anytime device actions comes up, it should bear repeating that retire will force someone to re-enroll, wipe will wipe out the device and start from scratch. And if in that time frame you've disabled them for logon, they're not going to be able to sign back in and re-enroll the device in order to get back to that company data. Anyways, great place for us to end off. So thank you for everyone. You've been great. Next up, we have the next AMA, which is all things Copilot with Microsoft Intune. So go check that out. Again, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Per, for answering the questions. And thank you, everyone who attended, for dropping those questions in. As always, have a wonderful day, and we'll catch you next time.